Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the meeting, which is Cardiology Echo. I am Dr. Neeraj Bhalla. I am your host and I am the hub. Uh, we are expecting a lot of more people to join. I thought I'll take this opportunity to introduce to everyone what is the format of this meeting, what is Echo, and what do we hope to achieve by this. So echo does not stand for echocardiography, like I mentioned in some of my messages to you, because as soon as you say cardiology and echo, it means echocardiography. But echo in this case stands for Extension for Community Health Outcomes. Extension of what? Extension of technology to disseminate information, expertise, updates in places where they may not be easily available. And this is inspired from a movement which started in the US by Dr. Sanjeev Arora, who is a gastroenterologist and who was treating a hepatitis C epidemic in the state of New Mexico about 10 years ago. And he found that in many of the places that the patients were there, the expertise in the rapidly changing field to treat this was not available. So he started this tele-mentoring and telemedicine or telecommunication with many of the participants. And this program has grown worldwide. It has become an independent entity in India. And the ECHO movement in the US has become so important, so popular that even the president has awarded them a gold medal. They are up for a grant by the MacArthur Foundation for one of the most impactful social programs. And so based upon that, I felt that we should also try to take this forward. And so this meeting is, and the meeting subsequently, we have planned a 12-session meeting. It's going to be purely educational, interactive, not anything to do, no pharma sponsors, no agenda apart from dissemination of knowledge, sharing of knowledge and information so that we can all learn and all teach. So that is what ECHO is, cardiology is going to be. What is the purpose is again simply to share information, updates with everyone who's participating, who's interested, so that whatever might be the latest information that we have, it may be disseminated to wherever you are. And we are hoping for better clinical outcomes for all your patients. How are the meetings going to be conducted? So any person facing, for example, a clinical problem. So when we started this, one of our participants, Dr. Rajiv Verma, said that, I have got a case in my family, which is a strange case of pericardial effusion, or pericarditis. The person kept having pericardial effusion, not resolving. So could we discuss this case? So just like that, it is going to be driven by problems faced by anyone in the group. That if you have got a particular case or a particular issue that you would like to be discussed, we will then take it up and we will have a format whereby we will have a small presentation and then a discussion with everyone's inputs and try to find solutions to the problem. So this is everyone learns, everyone teaches, everyone's inputs are welcome. And based upon the feedback that we get is how we are going to structure the next programs. In the forms that we gave to a lot of people, a lot of suggestions have come about what they would like to be covered. But we are going to keep this as a case-based program. Case-based means that we're going to have people coming up with real people, with real patients, and based upon that, we would like to discuss and find out real solutions. So that's basically the format. So what we are going to do today is it's going to be the problem case that Dr. Rajiv presented. So Dr. Rajiv, I'll request you, why don't you present us your case, that what problem you faced. Then we'll have a small didactic presentation and then we'll open it for discussion. All right. So you will have to unmute your mic, Dr. Rajiv. So also I'm requesting everyone should have their videos on. We would like everyone to participate so that we can see everyone and everyone can be seen to us. You may mute your mics except for the speaker, but when we open up for discussion, everyone may unmute themselves. So we'd like all participants to please put on your video. And Dr. Rajiv. Yeah, Dr. Rajiv, are you ready with your presentation, with your case? Is your mic on? Yes. So Dr. Rajiv, we can't see you.
Is it okay now?
Yes, it's okay now. So please start. Tell us the case that you had that you felt was a problem that could be discussed.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the expert panel for their guidance during dilemma in handling cases. I will read out briefly about my friend, an eye specialist who suffered from pericarditis and pleural effusion. The case is like this. He is 67 years, hypertensive, pre-diabetic, with no history of previous coughs, uremia, or autoimmune disease. It all started with low-grade fever and fatigue, which lasted for 12 to 13 days. Thereafter, he felt dyspnea while climbing stairs. There was no chest pain, no chest discomfort, no pedal edema. He got X-ray chest, which revealed left-sided pleural effusion, which was minimal on ultrasound. There was no other parenchymal involvement on X-ray chest. ECG was normal without ST changes. Echo revealed minimal posterior pericardial effusion without akinesia, and left LVEF was 64%. CT scan revealed similar findings and no significant mediastinal nodes, and pericardial wall thickness was normal without scarring. CRP was normal and ESR was 52. MON2 was more than 10 mm. He consulted one physician at Gangaram who tabbed pleural fluid but was non-conclusive, being hemorrhagic, and ADA level was below 30. He started ATT, which could not be tolerated. I think the speed is okay with the speed. He started ATT, which could not be tolerated because of GI side effects, and he discontinued after 5 days, with a plan to restart later and review later. By the meantime, he consulted another physician at Gangaram who advised prednisolone 30 mg per day. By this time, his fever settled and there was no breathlessness. And he did not continue steroids and neither taken ATT thereafter. Since 4 months, he is fine without any relapse. So pertaining to this, I have few questions. Shall I speak now questions?
Yeah, you can tell what were the issues that came up in your mind.
Yeah. Since mild idiopathic or viral pericarditis subside by itself in 3 weeks, which cases need NSAIDs, steroids, or ATT in such ambiguous situations? Number 2, how long colchicine or steroids be continued if inflammatory markers are not much raised? Okay. Number 3, which
Yes.
cases are predictors of relapse or of poor prognosis?
Okay.
And what is the preventive management to stop constructive pericarditis to happen or for temporary to happen?
Okay. All
in
right.
case of tubercular or autoimmune disease, pericarditis. What are the early indicators of viral myocarditis? I think it's a different subject now.
Yeah. So maybe we'll, because myocarditis is a full subject on its own.
Okay.
So we can avoid the myocarditis. And these are good enough questions that you have raised about pericarditis.
And one thing more, because the viral, which we call it idiopathic, sometimes it's viral because both present with a mild grade fever. So there's no test to find what viral is there. And it happened before COVID. His COVID, IgM, IgG are negative now.
Right.
And kindly enlighten us.
Okay, good. So thank you. So you have presented us with a case of pericarditis and presenting with non-specific signs and symptoms, as is quite often the case. And basically, it was the investigation that is on echo, you found some mild pericarditis. Am I right?
Right.
Yeah. Now, my understanding of this case is that many of the situations that we have in our country, because we are still very high with tuberculosis, we tend to first think pericarditis equals to tuberculosis unless proved otherwise.
Right.
And I think that is what happened to your patient. Even with mild pericardial effusion, there was an attempted drainage made, and not unsurprisingly, the drainage was either not successful or only hemorrhagic fluid could be drained. We do not know whether that hemorrhagic fluid came from ventricle or from the fluid or from the pericardium.
No, it was a pleural tap.
It was a pleural tap. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. As far as quite often we get requests to drain pericardial fluid because of the physician is not able to reach a diagnosis.
Yeah.
But let me tell you that pericardial fluid by itself almost never reveals a definitive diagnosis.
Right.
We either get an exudative, which is most of the time, or we get hemorrhagic fluid. Only 2 or 3 situations where we can make a diagnosis of based upon the analysis of the pericardial fluid. Most common is neoplastic, where you can see malignant cells, because neoplastic effusions are huge. You get a large volume of pericardial fluid that you can analyze and you are able to pick up. Almost never you are able to see mycobacteria. Almost never you are able to identify any other thing. The second commonest diagnostic yield from pericardial fluid is when the patient has purulent or bacterial pericarditis, and that is a very pathognomic. When you draw the fluid, it is turbid, you have large number of polymorphs, very low pH, and you can culture some organism maybe from it. So bacterial pericarditis and neoplastic pericardial effusion, these are the 2 cases where you will have diagnostic yield from pericardial fluid. In all other cases, the diagnosis is made by ancillary investigations. For example, a malignancy, you will find some node somewhere or a mass somewhere. Tuberculosis, you will find caseating lymph node somewhere. And it is from there that we are able to make a diagnosis. 1 or 2 more exotic things might be that in myxedemic pericardial effusion, you might find cholesterol crystals, or in rheumatoid pericardial effusion, you might find extremely low sugars. So these are the only cases where you might find a yield. Any other suggestions from anyone or any other points you would like to raise? Let's open it up for discussion. Everyone, please put on your videos and please unmute yourself.
Can you suggest, can we depend upon 24 gold test?
Yes.
Can we depend upon for starting ATT?
I have certain questions before we go on to that. This patient was started with ATT, and as Dr. Verma said that ATT was not tolerated, he had GI symptoms.
Yeah.
So what were the GI symptoms that we have to stop ATT, number 1? Second thing is that on what basis ATT was started in this patient? Only on the basis of MONTUS more than 10 and ESR 52. And this patient taped, the pleural effusion was drained, diagnostic under the ultrasound, or it was just a traumatic hemorrhagic fluid which came?
It was ultrasound guided. It was ultrasound guided, and there was basically, basically the ESR was high, MONTU was positive, and there was a family history of a tubercular meningitis in the wife.
That's right. But were the other constitutional symptoms like weight loss, anorexia?
Weight loss, that was because of the viral fever is having for about 12 days.
So I think let's open up the discussion. Let other people also give their inputs. That
yes.
In a case of such nature, what should be the indication for starting ATT? Is simply a MONTU of more than 10 enough, and raised ESR enough to start ATT? So let us see what is the opinion of the senior physicians and all, because this is a situation that faces us quite commonly. And giving ATT to a patient is not a small thing for the patient. It's difficult to tolerate. There are significant side effects. How long to continue? And so there are many things in this. So what do the other participants would like to have any more information, or is this enough to start ATT? Maybe someone else can come in.
I'm saying, because in such a scenario, if ATT was started, unnecessarily he would have continued.
Yeah, no, so let us see. Obviously, whoever the physician was had something in their mind. So we are here to discuss whether this was enough or not. Maybe someone else can give us some inputs as to, do you think this was enough, good enough to start ATT, or was it, obviously in this case, it was not good enough because the patient recovered, never took ATT and simply recovered.
Yeah.
So in such a case of pericardial effusion, pleuropericardial effusion, what information should be, maybe that is something that we should think about before starting ATT. The decision should not be taken lightly.
Hello, I have a question in mind. Actually, you say that ESR was raised and Montus was positive, and patient also having pleural effusion.
Yeah.
What is the cause of pleural effusion? In my thinking, as per my knowledge, I think it was a definite tubercular infection, and I hope so it may be subsided by the patient's body immunity. Now, what was the reason of it pleural effusion? As you are saying, it is a viral.
Yeah, most probably it's a viral, because he would have deteriorated by now, because it's almost 4 months. He has not taken any ATT thereafter. He has not taken.
And what was the cause of pleural effusion? And what was the cause of pleural effusion?
That was not identified.
Viral.
Only presumptive.
I think it may be because of tubercular infection. There are many people who have tubercular infection that indicates the Montus positive, means a patient having infection. It may be subsided by the patient's own immunity.
But
that is one reason.
But we don't depend on Montu now that much.
How much was the age of the patient?
Montu positivity is seen in many cases.
Age is 67 years. 67 years.
67-year-old patient, pre-diabetic, with history of low-grade fever and with raised ESR and Montus positive. I mean, we could have tubercular infection as one of the differential diagnoses, but one has already ruled out, the neoplastic cause of pericardial effusion, because in malignancy, normally the effusion is very large. And it was just a minimal effusion. I mean, at times we do see when we do an echo, a minimal effusion, but then, without any contributory evidence, it subsides on its own. So whether the patient responded to, whether the dyspnea was because of pericardial effusion, I don't think so. And what was the cause of dyspnea in this case? Was it due to pleural effusion? What was the size, amount of pericardial and pleural effusion?
So, if I may say, anyone else has any other inputs, maybe. So, I think, would anyone else like to
I want to say that nowadays GeneXpert is available. So why wasn't that done?
Hemorrhagic.
GeneXpert. Can we see? May I request the participants to put their videos on? We'd like to see who's speaking also. So I'll request all the participants, if maybe you could put on your videos, we could be able to see. So I think the suggestions are that maybe some more investigation like a GeneXpert could have been done to, tell us that whether this patient had tuberculosis before starting ATT. And I think the consensus is that this patient very well could have been having pleuropericardial tuberculosis. But as the case has unfolded, the patient has improved without ATT. So it gives us pause to think that before we rush to start ATT in this patient, maybe something else like more confirmatory, maybe a contrast CT of the chest, or waiting for some time for evolution, CT of the chest and abdomen, look for features of tuberculosis elsewhere. Maybe a GeneXpert test could have been resorted to rather than starting ATT. I think we are all in India very quick to take therapeutic decisions based on not very narrow, not very, definitive clinical grounds. And I think we all see this in the case of antibiotics also. And this case is telling us that the ATT probably was not justified. So maybe some other investigation to confirm tuberculosis would have been better rather than before starting it.
Right.
Do we have the report of the pleural fluid aspirated, the biochemical and cytological report of the pleural fluid, because that will also give us an indication, though it was hemorrhagic,
Yeah.
but whether it was exudate or what were the other findings?
That I'm not having, but it was non-conclusive as I talked to him.
Okay. Dr. Chadda, good evening. Would you like to give your opinion? Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I think Dr. Chadda,
Yes.
especially regarding stopping ATT due to GI symptoms, his inputs will be very useful. But we would like your comments, sir.
See, GIT, you see, first thing is we always jump the gun. You already said that we are very quick to start things without even analyzing what it is. Because you see, there was no harm done if the treatment could have waited and more tests would have been carried out. Because starting ATT in a person who is 67 years old is always with the risk of hepatotoxin and other things. So you must wait, And as everybody is given the suggestion that investigations were not enough to start a ATT. Even if there's tuberculosis, what is wrong in waiting for say 10 days, 15 days? Because most of the tuberculosis patients, when you have a fever of this kind, if they are not very symptomatic, you can wait, because most of the patients who have good resistance, they fight with tuberculosis and it disappears, the fever disappears. We have seen so many times, even without starting, we find that a patient gets over his infection, even it may be tuberculosis. So we are not justified in starting ATT in a person. He will have all GI side effects. You see, I've seen most of the people who are tuberculous, they tolerate anti-tubercular treatment very well, and where we give it, somebody gives, without reason, they can't tolerate it. Maybe I don't know what happens in a person, why they are able to tolerate ATT better, who really are diabetic. This is of the I'm saying, but there is absolutely no need to start ATT. We can always wait, go for further investigations. Even investigations sometimes don't help us, we still start ATT, but that is after a gap of time where we find that we are against a wall, where no investigation is helping us, you are justified. Otherwise, in a patient like this, where the fusion is also minimal, then there's no justification of starting ATT.
So if we analyze in the retrospect, it looks that it was a case of viral fever, and secondarily viral, we can say the viral pleural effusion, which subsided on its own without any treatment over a period of time. Is it like that?
It could be this only, or as Madam was saying, that it must be a case of early, a kind of reactive tuberculosis, which produce these things, and then they subside by the good resistance of the person. That we have seen many times. Clinical situations, we find so many people don't require ATT. Yeah, they are able to control it. Yeah.
So I have a question from the physicians that this ADL level, we are very keen to check the ADL level in pericardial fluid especially, and this seems to be a sine qua non of tubercular infection. So what is the sensitivity and specificity, if someone can let me know, because this is the only thing that is derived from the pericardial fluid that seems to make people start ATT, if given everything else is equivocal in a case like this.
See, ADA is just a a sign which tells that it is more towards exudate. It just says, if the fluid is exudate and ADA is positive, then we tend to think that it is actually exudate, and exudate normally occurs if there's tuberculosis. You never find exudate fluid in a viral infections. You'll always have a tubercular or some other infection like which could produce a exudate. So that only substantiates that it's exudative effusion. Exudative effusions, we tend to think that it will be tuberculosis. Yeah.
Yeah. In our country, sorry, please go ahead.
What was the CBC, this thing of the patient, complete blood count and differential counts?
Yaşlı bir tekfuru devirip yerine geçmek isteyen kibirli ve
Yeah. So Dr. Rajiv, I think Dr. Padma Shri was asking, was there anything abnormal in the CBC and differential counts that could?
That detail has not been provided to me.
Okay. What is the purpose of asking that question, Dr. Padma Shri? Why specifically did you ask that question? What information were you trying to?
Because I wanted to know if the patient had lymphocytosis or lymphocytopenia. One of the indirect pointers towards the etiology of the.
So again, I think these are all very non-specific things, and including, Dr. Chadha, I think any inflammatory pericardial effusion will, including, for example, a viral infection might have raised ADA. Viral pericardial effusions are not really transudative; they're also inflammatory. So if ADA is, since we are hardly diagnosing viral infections, it's difficult. But I think if ADA is simply a marker of an exudative effusion, it may not be taken as a holy grail that we need to start ATT, which seems to be the case.
Sir,
Absolutely right. Yeah.
The pleural fluid ADA of 72 international units per liter had sensitivity of 95.1% and specificity of 87.5. The positive predictive value of 95.1% and negative predictive value of 87.5% for the diagnosis of tubercular pleural effusion.
Okay,
so I think it has a good sensitivity. So if it is positive, along with the other features or other signs, it's not only that if ADA is positive, we straightforward can go for starting the anti-tubercular treatment. But if the clinical history, the clinical examination and other finds, if it is an exudative pleural effusion with all other cardinal signs of systemic illness of tuberculosis, then after excluding all other possible causes of acute illness, we can give a trial of anti-tubercular treatment. And as Dr. Chadha rightly said, we have also seen in tubercular patients, the tolerance of the patient for the anti-tubercular treatment is quite good. But if there is no element of tuberculosis underlying, then usually the patients, they don't tolerate these anti-tubercular. This
Absolutely.
has been seen
Yes.
practically also.
Yes. Yes.
I think this is a very, very valid clinical observation made by clinicians that if a person has a particular condition, he or she will tolerate the drugs, but if the person does not, he or she will manifest the toxicities of the drugs.
Yes.
Probably not written anywhere, but I think all of us have experienced that.
Yes, we have experienced that. Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So I think now enough about the case. Let's have a small presentation.
Sir, one more thing I wanted to ask. And during the COVID period at the present time, what is the incidence of pericardial effusion? I'm not talking about myocarditis, the pericardial effusion in the COVID era.
We just had a patient 2 days ago in the ICU who had a tamponade-like situation. So whether it is the COVID is causal or it is incidental, we do not know. As far as the pathophysiology is concerned, there does not seem to be any direct attack of the virus either on the myocardium or the pericardium. Whatever damage to the myocardium is seen is due to a microangiopathic process, thrombotic process, producing a type 2 myocardial infarction with raised enzymes and consequent LV dysfunction. There is no evidence of infiltrates, viral infiltrates, or other infiltrates to suggest myocarditis. This is the current state of knowledge. As later on, we don't know, but at present, it does not seem to be directly myocardic or pericardic toxic.
Thank you, sir.
So, if we may, now I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Bilal. He will make a short presentation on pericarditis, which will encapsulate most of the questions that have been asked by Dr. Rajiv Verma and also give us a good revision of the topic. Okay, so over to Dr. Bilal. And with this, we'll wrap up this session so that we would have comprehensively discussed pericarditis. In the meantime, I'll request you two things. There is a feedback form which might be circulated. You can fill that up. And B, anyone who would like to discuss any such cases like Dr. Rajiv has discussed and try to find more information, we'll be happy to do that in the further cases. So Dr. Bilal, please.
Right. Good evening to everyone. So we will be talking about pericarditis, a complete guide of pericarditis. What are the manifestations? What are the so pericardium, as we see, have got two layers: visceral and parietal pericardium. So the permissible amount of fluid is around 15 to 50 ml, which is normally there in the pericardium. So what is the etiology? What are the diseases or what are the infections that can take over to pericardium and cause acute pericarditis, and acute pericarditis in later on can manifest with various diseases. So infections stage of the first, and among them viral is the most common, and the various viruses, they can be coccyx, ecoviruses or herpes or parvo. Right now we can talk about SARS-CoV, which again can cause pericardial inflammation, which can lead to acute pericarditis or cardiac tamponade. Second will remain the bacterial, and among them the most common in our country will be the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And rest of the bacterial infections can happen. They can cause pericardial inflammation, pericarditis. So fungal is a very rare parasitic infections. They can occur in pericardium. They can present as pericarditis, pericardial tamponade, or they can present as a mass in pericardium or a neoplastic-like growth in the pericardium, like echinococcus or toxoplasmosis. So the non-infectious causes is a very major, more than 50% are non-infectious. Among them are the autoimmune, very common autoimmune causes like rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus erythematosus, or the many causes that have been mentioned, which are autoimmune and cause pericardial inflammation, and they can present as this pericardial effusion with pericardial tamponade. So neoplastic, they can be primary or secondary. Primary neoplastic causes of pericardium are very rare, but secondary malignancy from distant sites, from lungs, from liver, from the gut, they can happen, or the lymphomas, they can secondary metastasize to pericardium and can present as pericarditis or pericardial tamponade. So metabolic causes, CKD, uremia is the most common, myxedema due to this thyroid deficiency can present as pericarditis or pericardial tamponade. So traumatic or iatrogenic causes, they are very rare, but they are there. So we can see direct penetrating injuries to chest can cause pericarditis, or indirect injuries. They can be blunt or like radiation injury. They are indirect. Delayed onset pericardial injury syndromes. They can be post-myocardial, like Dressler syndrome. They can cause pericarditis or pericardial effusion. So non-infectious causes can be there. These can be drugs like lupus like manifestation of drugs which can cause pericarditis, like procainamide, hydralazine, methyl dopa, isoniazid, or phenytoin. So there can be antineoplastic drugs which can cause pericarditis or myopericarditis, or they can present as acute tamponade. So other causes like collagen vascular diseases, amyloidosis, and organs in near to pericardium can cause acute pericarditis or pericardial effusion. It can be aortic dissection or PH or other chronic heart failure conditions. Other very common, very rare congenital diseases, they with absence of pericardium can be there. So etiology, if we do not find anything, we just label it as idiopathic. That is one common cause. We cannot find any cause of pericarditis or pericardial effusion, so we label them as idiopathic pericarditis. So diseases of pericardium can be acute pericarditis, and this acute can in turn return to recurrent pericarditis. Acute pericarditis can present as a pericardial effusion with or without tamponade or hemodynamic compromise. So in later on, it can turn out to be a calcific constrictive pericarditis. So pericarditis, we can classify them as, if it is less than 6 weeks, we label them as acute. Between 6 weeks to 6 months of acute, and if it is more than 6 months, then we label them as chronic pericarditis. So if we see the clinically how the patient will present, so if we see the ECG findings will show stage 1 will be a diffuse ST elevation, typically going up. Stage 2, there will be a normalization of ST segment and the STPR segment. 3, there will be the T wave, T troughs will be there, there will be deep T wave inversions. 4, there will be a normalization of the ECG, and the typical evolution will be ST coving, then settling of the ST and PR segments, and there will be diffuse T wave inversions, and with time the ECG will normalize. Sometimes T wave inversions may persist. So this is the ST segment, diffuse ST segment elevation in all age. So this can be a typical presentation of acute pericarditis. So echocardiography will give us the detail of the pericardial effusion, not the acute pericarditis. It can give us whether there is effusion present, that is mild, moderate, or severe, or causing tamponade or not. Chest X-ray will not help us except in constrictive pericarditis. Cardiac biomarkers, if myocardium is involved, there is a myopericarditis, then these troponins, troponin I or T, may be raised. There are markers of inflammation like ESRs, CRP, they might be raised in viral or any other infective causes. So elevation of troponins is associated with a poor prognosis. So that means the myocardium is also involved. So that is what myopericarditis will be labeled if troponins are raised. So treatment, what is the major important part of acute pericarditis? It should not be delayed. It should be started as immediately as possible. However, if patient is having pericardial effusion or tamponade, that has to be managed. So the drugs which commonly are used are NSAIDs and steroids. So these are the commonly prescribed drugs. This was the ESC guidelines 2015, which are very recent guidelines. So this is the aspirin, brufen, NSAID, and colchicine. So aspirin, this is the dose 750 to 1 gram every 8 hourly for 1 to 2 weeks. Then we have to taper down the dose slowly over 1 to 2 weeks. So again, brufen, NSAIDs, that is 600 milligram every in a very high dose over 1 to 2 weeks, and start decreasing it over 1 to 2 weeks to 100 to 400 milligram every day. So colchicine, it is 0.5 milligram once if it is weight is less than 70, or we can give it twice if patient is weighing more than 70. So it has to be given over a period of 3 months. So this is the class of indication. Aspirin or NSAID, first line therapy should be they should be started with some gastroprotection drugs. Class of indication is class 1. Colchicine is recommended as a first line of drug of acute pericarditis with adjuvant of aspirin or NSAIDs. It cannot be started as alone. So serum CRP should be considered to guide the treatment or length of access of the therapy. So CRP levels are more important in monitoring whether we have to decrease the dose or we have to keep the same dose, or we have to add on aspirin, NSAID with colchicine or not. So steroids have got a role. They should be considered in acute pericardium cases of contraindication, like failure. We cannot give aspirin, we cannot give NSAIDs, or we cannot give colchicine to a patient, or when an infectious cause has been excluded or ruled out, or when there is specific indications such as autoimmune disease. So 3 indications: we cannot give NSAIDs or aspirin or colchicine. So infections has been ruled out, or there is some autoimmune disease. They are the indication for steroids. So these are the limit recommendations. The patient should not be allowed for exercise, and monitoring should be done with ECG, CRP, ECG, and echocardiogram. For athlete, duration of exercise should be restricted. They should be asked for the bed rest, and monitoring with CRP, ECG, and echocardiogram for at least 3 months should be done. Steroids should not be recommended as a first line in acute pericarditis. So this is again the doses of this NSAIDs and this colchicine. So sequelae, what this acute pericarditis results in. So they can result into cardiac tamponade, pericardial effusion with tamponade. They can result into constrictive pericarditis. So they can result into effusoconstrictive pericarditis. It's a mixed picture of this. So the most important thing for us, which is a life-threatening condition, is cardiac tamponade, accumulation of fluid around the cardiac chambers, which results into compression of the cardiac chambers, and that can lead to tamponade. So these are the clinically how the patient will present. So Beck's triad, everybody knows, patient in shock with distended neck veins and no audible heart sounds. So this is J wave. J wave will be absence of Y wave. So because the ventricular filling is absent. Pulsus paradoxus, again, they fall in systolic BP. So how to measure it is more important. Get a manual BP cuff and inflate it until above systolic BP. Then very slowly, every 2 millimeter, we have to deflate the cuff and release until you start hearing sound, first protocough sounds. So the intermittent protocough sounds will be the first presentation. Second, keep on measure it. Second, keep on deflating the cuff. Once you hear the audible sounds in each cardiac cycle, that will be the second reading. So difference between them should not be more than 10 millimeter. If it is more than 10, that is the pulsus paradoxus. So this is a 2-dimensional echo where we can see, if we see this is a longitudinal view of where we this is where the RV and RA are collapsed. There is a huge pericardial effusion. We can see, we have just still this film. You can see the collapse of RV and RA. These are not getting filled. This is a short axis view where we can see the pericardial effusion, huge pericardial effusion. Again, we can see the RV collapse. And if we put a Doppler, this is the Doppler where we can see the restrictive mitral flow. This is the IVC where we can see a hugely dilated IVC with less than 50% respiratory variation. This is a subcostal wave where we can see RA, RV compressed during diastole. This is the IVC again where there is a still frame of IVC. Thanks. Thanks.
Yes, so brief presentation on pericarditis and its major complication, that is cardiac tamponade, I thought this would be useful. So if there are any other points to be discussed in this case or any other queries after the presentation, I think Dr. Rajiv's many of the questions have been addressed during the presentation, that regarding the treatment for non-specific pericarditis is, I think, very nicely, and these are the latest guidelines that have been shown, 2015, that start with NSAIDs. So, they're very fond of using aspirin, but in our country, we are not used to prescribing such heavy doses of aspirin. But NSAIDs are a good option. In two conditions, you need to avoid NSAIDs, especially in post-myocardial infarction patients, and steroids also in post-MI patients who have a Dressler syndrome or significant pericardial effusion. These patients, the myocardial healing is inhibited by NSAIDs and steroids. So in this setting, we should avoid. But otherwise, we can try. Also, colchicine has come as a mainstay in prevention of recurrent pericarditis. So colchicine should be continued for 3 months initially. And if there is recurring pericarditis, then continue for 6 months. No need to taper it, but in conjunction with NSAIDs. So that is, I think, an important piece of information, that we should be using colchicine in our patients along with NSAIDs in non-specific pericarditis. I think in this case of Dr. Rajiv's, maybe a trial with aspirin or NSAIDs along with colchicine would have been justifiable, and waited for more evidence of tuberculosis to come along before starting on ATT. As far as steroids is concerned, I think steroids, unless you have ruled out any infection, if it's not a post-myocardial Dressler syndrome, only then we should give steroids. But steroids can actually increase the chances of relapsing or recurring pericarditis. So we should choose this with care. I think that's what I have to say. Any other points anyone would like to discuss, ask, or clarify? Any comments, please? Welcome.
I have just a comment to make. I'm Dr. Chadha. That you see, effusions, whether pericardial or pleural, the organisms are seldom located there because it is an allergic reaction. It's an allergic reaction. So most of the time we are guided by, because in my time I've done a lot of pleural biopsies by Abraham needle in our hospital days, and seldom used to find any evidence of tuberculosis with these biopsies. So most of the time the fluid comes because of the allergic reaction. It's an exudation because of the inflammation. So organisms are very difficult to find. So we have to go by these tests only and clinical parameter. You cannot hurry on starting treatment unless the effusion is massive or we are pressed for time. Then only we should do. And most of the time, if we're treating pericardial effusion, we start steroids with ATT. That's what we have been doing to prevent cardiac so-called thickening, pericardial thickening, or later on, calcification there.
Yeah.
So
Very
these
true.
are the points.
I'll make 2 points. I forgot. Steroids, very important role in autoimmune disorders, proved autoimmune disorders. So this is something by steroids, or even steroid-sparing agents and other immunosuppressants might be used. So that is an important subject that we tend to not see or overlook. But this is an important thing. Secondly, very rightly, as you said, sometimes we do a pericardial biopsy or make a pericardial window to try and look for any granulomas in the pericardium. But even there, the yield is not very high. Sometimes you have to strip the entire pericardium and then look for granulomas to make a diagnosis. So, and you're very right. One of the questions that Dr. Rajiv raised was, how do we prevent the progression to tamponade, or very, very important is constriction, because constriction is a terrible disease. Constrictive pericarditis carries a 15 to 20% mortality as such for surgery, and otherwise it's a very terrible disease. So we have to try to prevent constriction, and we, for whatever evidence we have or don't have, depend on steroids under the cover of ATT to try and prevent the progression of effusion to tamponade or to constriction. I think that is the practice. So if anyone has any more points, we'll wait for your comments. If not, then maybe we can bring this session to an end. I hope, Dr. Rajiv, your issues were clarified, or you were able to gain some insight into your case.
Quite informative. It's quite informative. But do we have any cases of sarcoidosis causing pericarditis? Sarcoidosis. How many cases you have seen?
We have seen sarcoidosis. We have seen causing AB blocks. Occasionally, we have seen pericardial effusions also. And for us, the diagnosis is very easy because we are able to. We almost always do a CT of the chest, and it becomes reasonably easy to pick up sarcoid. We have seen some cases.
Right. Plus angiotensin converting enzyme.
Of course.
Right.
Sarcoids seldom lead to effusions. Sarcoids are basically granulomatous diseases which are in the tissue. So I have rarely seen. I've seen so many cases of sarcoidosis, never effusion with it. Maybe I'm not lucky to.
No, we have seen a few. Mostly their presentation is, like I said, with AB blocks, because they occur in the, like you said, in the myocardium, and they may compress that. But we have seen some. So if there are no further questions or any this thing, I hope we'll close this. As I promised, we'll close this within the hour. And the object was to discuss this problem case that Dr. Rajiv brought out. And I hope we have served the purpose of this meeting, which, as I said in the beginning, is to share knowledge and information, disseminate what are the best practices, and learn from everyone. So if we are done, then I'll say goodbye to you. And we are planning to hold these sessions once in a week or once in 2 weeks, and it will be based upon the feedback and the problem or any clinical problem that you people are facing, and we will let you know in advance. So if you enjoyed this session, please do attend the next sessions that we have. The plan is to have 12 such sessions in the first go, which will be, each will be once in 2 weeks, again looking at a common or uncommon clinical problem, which is, or any issue which is creating, which you would like to be clarified or to have more information or more inputs on.
So I have a small announcement to make, Dr. Bhalla, if I can.
Yes, Doctor. Let me just introduce Prashant. Prashant Pillai is from ECHO India, which is the mother organization under the umbrella of which we got the inspiration, and we are doing this. So please go ahead, Prashant.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bhalla. So for everyone's information, I've just shared a small feedback form with everyone. So kindly request you all to share your feedback with us. I think it will help us improve the quality of the sessions and come up with more such sessions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening ahead, and see you all next time.
Bye.